In the late 90s, the Sony PlayStation had Resident Evil 1 and 2, also 3 if you lived in Japan because it came out in 2000 here in the States, and Silent Hill. All of which I see get way too often mistakenly credited for founding the survival horror genre. Although, that claim really belongs to two different games. The first one being the Japanese exclusive RPG Sweet Home on the Famicom, that of which had its director go on to conceive the first Resident Evil as kind of like a remake of it. And then the other game was the original Alone in the Dark by Infogrames, which took the gameplay of Sweet Home, removed the party system to focus on one character specifically, added a little bit of a higher focus of resource management, and put it into a cinematic camera angle thing with real-time combat. Sweet Home's creator, Tokuro Fujiwara, would look fondly on and be heavily inspired by this game when it came to conceiving the 3D remake of his game Sweet Home, which, again, was what went on to be Resident Evil 1. Not to mention, Alone in the Dark was the first 3D survival horror and was what kickstarted the genre as we knew it. I say new because I don't think I've really seen another horror game like this for a very long time. Most of them nowadays are just kind of generic walking jump scare simulators and kind of suck. We've got some pretty cool stuff cooking up in the indie scene like Elisa and Tormented Souls, but yeah, I mean in AAA titles, these kind of horror games are totally gone. But going back to what I wanted to introduce to you today, after the first Resident Evil, two games really dominated the horror genre. Its sequel Resident Evil 2, which came out in '98, and Silent Hill, which came out in '99. Both were by Japanese studios, and both were console-specific games, at least until RE2 got a PC port and a bunch of other ports too, but still. What about here in Lil Ol' America? And what about games specifically with PC in mind? Well,
let's find out.
Enter in the PC-focused developers Terminal Reality, known at the time for previously making flight sim games for Microsoft. They founded their own company and launched their first game with one of the most important companies in the industry, 3D Realms, and it was a flight sim, but instead of being simmy, it was more of like an arcade game that was more focused on combat. They made a few more of these as well as a game I personally grew up with called Monster Truck Madness, which some of you probably also know. But yeah, they kept on making stuff like this and it kind of became their signature work, at least until they ended up starting work on their own survival horror game to rival the likes of Resident Evil 2. I don't think Silent Hill was even announced here in North America at the time, so I'm not too sure if it had any influence on this game. In January 1998, Terminal Reality became an equity partner of Gathering of Developers, or God Games, and it was a company that was formed for developers to put out the games that they wanted without any big company telling them how to release or censor their games. Indie stuff really wasn't a thing like it is now, so this was pretty much crazy, and it made God Games like the ideal publisher for such a game. Indie stuff back in the day wasn't really a thing like it is now. You typically needed a pretty big publisher to get any sort of remote success with your game. God Games was formed by former Terminal Reality employees as well as other bigger people in the industry. So this meant that people could make what we know now as indie games, and also not guaranteed but have some sort of remote success. This new horror game they wanted to make was the brainchild of Mark Randall, the studio president, and Drew Haworth, the first employee of the studio. Mark had been pretty hard at work on a special graphics engine with really powerful lighting technology at the time, titled the Demon Engine, and he wanted to make a game that showed it off really well. And let me tell you right now that this game is beautiful with the lighting, even still over 20 years later. I have a lot to discuss about this game's visuals, so I'm just going to save it for when I go over the game itself. Going back to the development history, Drew had been a pretty big fan of those pulp action stuff in the 30s and 20s, and he wanted to create a game using this engine that was pretty much a homage to that entire era. Somehow horror came into the picture since I guess they were all huge fans of classic monster movies and they wanted to also make it a homage to that, and thus, the game was in development. There's been a rumor going around that 2001's Alone in the Dark New Nightmare used this Nocturne engine, and I'm not really sure how people got the impression of that, but no, it's not. New Nightmare uses something called the Renderware engine, which is an entirely different thing. They're totally different engines, completely different studios, and completely different games. The main character they decided on for the game was Stranger, which was a gruff hard-ass that had a personal, extreme hatred towards monsters, and is quite the skilled gunslinger. He was heavily inspired by the character The Shadow, and the game itself, as originally intended, did end up being heavily inspired of old classic horror films and pulp magazines. The game format also kinda takes influence from the said magazines too, because instead of a long continuous story, the game goes kind of like the old PC game route and is broken down into 4 different stories regarding the main events of the adventures. I'll get into all that later. There's a lot to talk about. When the game was first presented back in the day during E3, it made a pretty powerful and impactful first impression to its audience with its elaborate and quote-unquote realistic cloth animations, distinctive noir style, and extremely gory combat. But in addition, and even more impressive from a technical standpoint, was the dynamic lighting with real-time shadows cast from multiple light sources. Mirror effects also weren't a course of matter yet either. The mostly dark backgrounds themselves were standard fare for the late 90s renderings and stuff, but the way the effects helped merge them together with characters into a coherent whole hadn't really been seen in that quality before. And I will get to that when I go over the visuals in the game itself. But yeah, it caused quite the stir of impression back then. Despite that, it sold pretty horribly, and I'm not really sure why. Maybe the marketing was bad or something, or that, unlike FPS games that were dominating the computer game industry, the PC just really didn't have any sort of genuine audience for horror games yet like the PS1 did. Honestly, I have no idea what it was. Everyone I talked to that played this game back in the day told me that it's always remained one of their favorite games of all time. Hell, it's one of my favorite games of all time. I don't know what it is. Despite the pretty poor sales though, and probably the lack of widespread marketing, the marketing team did an outstanding job regarding the promotional material. I think they seriously went above and beyond for their trailers and posters, and I feel like they should have immediately made people want to play the damn game. Most games of the time have their trailers being brief moments or segments of gameplay, which is good, it's what you need, and I'd honestly take that any day over a lot of the trailers we have now that show like a crumb of gameplay with 98% of it being entirely cinematic animations that don't end up looking as good as the game itself, don't really show you what you're getting into. Anyways, yeah, for Nocturne, they made multiple very distinctive trailers that played out like a brief horror movie trailer or something, and it was just brilliant. The very first trailer was just gameplay overall with the initial game logo. Honestly, I prefer this logo much more than the one after and whatever we ended up getting. The next trailer was more gameplay too, nothing too crazy, still pretty good stuff. But then came the 4 cinematic trailers, and all copies of the game shipped with all 4 of these trailers put onto the first disc. These were each released monthly during the last 4 months before the game launched. The first one has the main character Stranger, acted and voice acted brilliantly by the late Lynn Mathis, telling the audience they don't even want to know a fraction of what he's been through. And this. Goddamn, man. This was how the hell you hype someone up for a horror game. I've still, to this day, never seen a trailer quite like this for any horror game. It mixed horrific images, great audio design, and dialogue with bits of gameplay sprinkled in here and there. And it was like a perfect mix of everything. It's so good. It is a little bit on the cheesy side, but honestly, I wouldn't want it any other way. And if you're a genuine horror fan, you probably wouldn't either. The funny thing is, despite the occasional cheesiness, they all feel like they have a rather serious slasher supernatural horror film feel. And I think they do the job just perfectly. The second trailer is with the colonel of the monster slaying group you're involved with talking about the monsters. More of the same good stuff. The third one is with one of the main characters, Svetlana, talking about her backstory briefly and how everything sucks. Also a great trailer. And the last one went on to be expanded and used in the final game, with the first half of the trailer ended up being what you see when you boot the game up, and the last half having a pretty much entire focus on gameplay. I have every single one of these trailers uploaded in a compilation video on this channel, so if you want to see all of them, you should go check that out. But I think I should show you that last one, because it's one of my favorite trailers of all time. And every time I see it, it just makes me itch to play this game again. All of these trailers were just incredible, and if you were a true horror fan at the time, or if you still are, I don't really have any doubt that these would have really scratched your itch. Before I go on to the unboxing, fun little random fact. The PlayStation 2 JRPG Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne had to credit this game in its title, while in Europe it was called SMT Lucifer's Call. This was only because Terminal Reality had the copyright for the Nocturne title itself. It had nothing to do with this game other than the title. And while that's a great JRPG on its own, it annoys me that every time I've tried looking at more info on this game, I just keep seeing more Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne stuff over and over and over again. It's pretty annoying. After a while of development, Nocturne was published by God Games and released on October 28th, 1999, just in time for Witches' Night. And also European box art that I really love for once. European PC game covers are usually the same as the American ones, but with slightly less cool details on the box. So personally, I always tend to prefer the American ones most of the time, but this one's still really cool. It does kind of look like a typical horror cover, not exactly a bad thing, but not quite as good as the other ones, so yet again is a moment where I do prefer the one that we got here in America of North and Japan. It's a cover that's genuinely creepy to look at, and I can't help but love it. It kind of makes me feel like I'm looking at something that I shouldn't be looking at, and there's not very many game covers that come to mind, if any, that I can really say that about. It's really simple. I don't really know how to explain it. I guess the best way to compare it would be like one of those weird-ass ghost sighting pictures. There's two kind of sinister looking figures that you can't really make out on the back, and they're both in front of what seems to be like an abandoned house in a lonely, cold, snowy yard, along with a probably black and white filter. It all adds up perfectly to make this cover pretty creepy, and for once, holy crap, for once, not relying on something ridiculous and over the top. Look at Silent Hill 4 or Dementium 2. Those are kinda creepy, but at the same time, they're more like weird nightmare visions. They're not necessarily bad, quite the opposite, and I love those covers in games, but man, this Nocturne cover just really well could be an actual ghost sighting picture that was taken. There's nothing too over the top or out of the realm of reality with actual humanoid figures and not some insane nightmare creatures. That's another cool game I want to review someday. Despite that, it still manages to instill feelings of unease, which I think makes it feel so much creepier than it has any right to be. Now, whether ghosts exist or not are always debated upon, but it's still a super effective cover nonetheless, and it still looks very much like a real picture that could have been taken, and immediately gets you ready for this insane game. I'm geeking out over the cover a little too much, but yeah. Anyways, lift open the flaps of the Nocturne teeth logo thing to reveal the gatefold, showing all kinds of crazy stuff. It's got some really nice screenshots and lists all the features in really messy cursive writing that gives off the impression it was written by either someone who's gone completely insane, is in a rush to get away from something crazy, or just has bad handwriting. The back continues that trend and leaves some room after the top portion to show off a pretty cool, creepy little picture. Here are the left and right sides of the box, which have the Nocturne logo on the bottom. Here's the top, and the bottom with the system requirements. Inside, you get the game itself on a jewel case boasting 2 CDs, a registration card, a God Games demo CD in some copies, mine which didn't have one, and an awesome game manual that's really thick with like 5 C's at the end. Just as I like my game manuals, this one is huge and it goes over all of the needed information you'll need for the game and has some really kick-ass drawings of characters and creatures all throughout the pages. Canada ended up getting the same exact box with the same contents, although their box size is slightly smaller for some reason. Normally with the box size difference, there's a slight change to the box's art in some areas, but I haven't really seen any changes with this box aside from being slightly less taller, which is a little weird. At least the smaller one lines up perfectly with the Blair Witch games, so that's really cool. Also, they got different disc art for some reason, which I found pretty neat. There's a bunch of other boxes that have the exact same box and contents, others missing the demo disc and having completely different artwork for the CDs. There's a bunch of different stuff, but I believe the last version that got put out had none of the same stuff, no contents at all inside the box aside from a tiny quick start sheet, and 2 discs now having a blue tint, and a post-2000 black ESRB logo. Regardless, if you actually want the boxes of this thing, it's surprisingly not too bad, considering how bad it sold. I personally spent about $35 on each of my 2 copies, thanks to my bro Andrew Topanian for hooking me up with them. I had no idea there were 2 different sized boxes up until I got these. Typically they're around $40 to $60 at the most for a complete copy, so it's really not that bad. Though, good luck, because that's only when it does pop up. Despite everything it had going for it, the game, as I said earlier, was a huge commercial failure. As a result, it's a bit of a pain to get physically nowadays, and it only pops up on eBay and other sites every couple of times a year. It's definitely not as rare as I would have thought, but it's still on the trickier side to hunt down. Is it worth it for you, scouring the internet for a copy? Probably not. Is it worth it for me, both as a macabre lover and a pretty big nutcase over this game? Yes, every second and every penny. But if you don't want to spend much, there are some other copies that get listed for fairly cheap, around like $20 or so just keep an eye out. Sometime last year, I got insanely lucky and I came across a Nocturne Halloween launch party press kit thing. And it came from someone who apparently did beta testing for PC game devs back in the day. I don't remember his name, I think it was like August something, but yeah, I mean it's really cool. It sadly doesn't have any of the old game data on it, but it does have some cool screenshots and trailers of other God games like Rune and Max Payne and some other stuff. There were sequels in the form of a Blair Witch trilogy, which I'll go into on a completely different day. I obviously am not going to do it in this video because it's probably going to be like an hour or 2 long. So lastly released for Nocturne was this awesome strategy guide. It's a really, really good one. I think this might be one of the best strategy guides I've ever owned or read. It does a great job explaining all the secrets, what each and everything in the game is, all the weapons, items, characters, enemies, everything. But even then, it goes the extra mile to have all of the dialogue in the game in here. which, while not useful if you're actually playing the game, it's still really cool because it shows things and it also shows things you could have missed. I haven't seen another strategy guide do this before, but you could essentially just get this book and know everything that happens in the game without actually playing it. I mean, no, don't do that, you'd be missing out on this gem of a game. Still, it's totally worth picking up if you ask me. It's practically impossible to find since I've only seen like a few copies for sale ever, but when it does show up, it's thankfully pretty cheap. I only paid like $8 for this a few months ago, which is a hell of a good deal considering its rarity if you ask me, and the other copies I've seen have been around that to maybe $15 tops, so it's really not that bad, but only get it if you really like this game. If you went to the original website back in the day, you could see all different kinds of stuff. Online news articles, links to different sites, including the spooky prop store, what they probably used when they filmed the live action trailers, support pages and FAQs, an old vintage looking picture with the heads of developers titled The Spookhouse Founders, the best completion times of the beta testers, animations, and descriptions of every single enemy, character, and creature in the game world, screenshots across all 4 chapters, awards, reviews, press media coverage, developer interviews, and downloads of demos, patches, and that sick-ass live-action trailer set that I mentioned earlier. There's a ton of stuff here, man, and I'm sure excited fans kept visiting the site over and over again back in the day, just waiting for the game to come out. I sure as hell would've. Regarding my personal history with the game, I haven't actually played the game until somewhat recently. I heard about it back in the late 2000s around the time I first played Blood Rain, and that's a game for another day too to explain on here, but from what I saw, I thought it looked awesome. I just couldn't find it anywhere online, so I never really got to play it. I had interest in the game, but it wasn't until I saw fellow goth gamer YouTuber Grimbeard's video on it, and it really made me want to play it. So I was destined to eventually get a nice big box of it, but I was pretty stingy with how much I wanted to spend. Fast forward a couple of years, still without much luck finding it online, and my friend I mentioned earlier hooked me up with both Nocturne big boxes. The day I got them here, I still remember my mom saying how creepy the cover looked, and I remember yelling in excitement and immediately running upstairs to my Windows 98, installing this bad boy and playing it all freaking weekend. And suffice to say, I've been a pretty big Nocturne nut ever since. Sudden voice change because I'm recording this on another day. If you're playing this on an older system like a Windows XP or preferably earlier like a Windows 98 like I did here, you can plop the disc in for a beautiful auto-run screen and installer, complete with concept art and music that actually follows the installer.
You will become one of us.
It's pretty cool stuff, and it gets you right in the mood for the game. At least it did for me. I also love the music that's being played in the background, even though, we'll get to that. And I also love the artwork it shows throughout the whole installation process. If you're playing on an older system, you will need a kinda beefy machine, due to how demanding this game was for the time, but the result is amazing if you got the wares. On modern systems with the out-of-the-box installation, the game won't run at all, and you'll often need to use a wrapper called DG Voodoo 2. I really don't prefer that for multiple reasons, so but what I do recommend, until my boy Steven from Night Dive Studios happens to secure the rights somehow, is go to My Abandonware, download the all-in-one installer, and install it that way. That'll be the full game configured to work out of the box on Windows 10 without DigiVoodoo 2, and this is nearly perfect. The issue is the game runs at an unlocked frame rate, and you think this would be a good thing, and it is in most cases, yeah. But the problem is, the game was never designed to pass, I'm guessing around 40 frames per second, because the game was running at around 30 even on the beefiest of PCs when it came out, and monitors from the time were generally never past 60 aside from movie directors and whatnot who had 144Hz. So as a result, this game has some really bad glitches when it's running past 60, most notably the physics. This game had notoriously advanced cloth animation physics, but if you're playing on a 240Hz monitor like me, or something higher like most people nowadays, it's gonna end up looking a little something like this. Manually setting the game to force lock at 45 using RetroDeath worked like a charm for me, and while yeah, it's still a little glitchy at times, it seemed to almost match the physics of how it worked on my 98 for the most part, and yeah, for some reason the physics are less glitchy on older hardware regardless of how low you lock the frame rate. I have no idea why, but if you want a comparison difference, here's it running at 30 on my Windows 10, versus uncapped, which is also around 30 because hardware, on my Windows 98. It's a notable difference, but it's not a deal breaker, so you can totally play this on your Windows 10. But I'd say the Windows 98 experience does still have the slight edge over it. It's weird to me how the cloth physics are tied to the frame rate, but at the same time still work better on older hardware. It's just bizarre. Higher uncapped frame rates can also lead to a chance of people running into walls and other people infinitely during cutscenes, and it looks bizarre. But if that happens, you're forced to skip the cutscenes, otherwise you're stuck in a limbo. There's also issues with the detection in regards to the use key on certain items and switches, which is also annoying. Although that part I'm not 100% certain on, but I do have a pretty good feeling about it based on my experiences between the PCs. For the full closest to accuracy effect, I would say lock it at 30, maybe. For some reason, you'll have to use a RetroDeath since the GeForce Experience or G-Sync or NVIDIA Inspector or literally anything for whatever reason just won't limit this game's frame rate even if you try forcing it to do so. So tough shit. On modern systems, every time you start up the game, you'll get this weird disk swap error thing. Luckily that can be fixed if you enable Windows 98 compatibility mode in the shortcut properties, so that's a pretty easy fix. And another thing that's extremely annoying is the UI having a delay of anything between 10 to 70 seconds. Yes, 70 f***ing seconds. I counted it, and no, I'm not exaggerating. It randomly does go between that range, and it's freaking annoying as hell. I wouldn't even put it past you if that's a deal breaker to not play this game, but it can be fixed, so hold on. For whatever reason, if you have the Blair Witch Volume 1 game installed, you can grab the dx7.dll thing and copy it, or download it from me since I'm such a nice guy, and put it in your Nocturne directory and replace it with whatever's in there. This will fix the super slow UI, but now at the cost of the game crashing from time to time, which is also very annoying. All of this could be avoided if you play the game on real hardware, which I know most of you don't have. But if you do, definitely go out of your way to play this on there, if you want to. But yeah, once all this is fine and dandy, blast open that exe and you're finally, holy shit, ready to go. Upon launching, you'll get an awesome full motion video taken from the 4th trailer and expanded for the game. It shows brief, live-acted segments of the main characters you'll see in the game, as well as various other things. Unlike, say, Resident Evil's intro, it didn't feel as goofy, and instead it felt a little more strange and creepy, much less like a cheap zombie flick like that, and more of, as I said earlier, some weird hybrid between a supernatural and slasher movie that I was about to watch, and it was so cool. It's nothing crazy, but I honestly really like this intro. I don't know why, I actually find it somewhat creepy, but a lot of other people in YouTube videos seem to agree, so that's cool. As soon as it's done, immediately you'll see a strangely aggressive main menu screen. It's awesome and it feels like it's pissed off at me or something for some reason. The hell did I do to you, man? I didn't even start the damn game yet. Oh, yeah. This is also that really cool music that was used in the installer, and I guess is like the main theme of the game or something. It's a public domain song, and it plays a lot. So it can probably get a little annoying to you, but whatever. I still think it's a cool song. You can adjust options with the graphical settings, completely customize your controls, which I totally recommend. You can adjust audio options, and this game did support EAX, and actually, to my surprise, manages to be one of the best games to make use of the 3D audio system. There's also some other stuff you can edit and blah blah blah. You can load a game or start a new one from any of the 4 episodes that I mentioned. I think this was done to be kind of like the old FPS games that people were used to at the time, which would make sense because that was the main target audience for PC gamers, so that it brought a sense of familiarity to a completely different genre. But also because, you know, they were super inspired by pulp magazines. So each of these episodes act like a little book, while the levels we go through act as chapters, which is pretty cool. We'll start at the first episode for the plot. Also, this game has some really cool loading screens. So the story isn't super in-depth or anything, but the main premise is that you take the role of an unnamed man, only known as Stranger by everyone around him. More on that later. He's relentless and he despises monsters for some reason that never gets revealed. I mean, this guy's basically infuriated at the mere sight, smell, or even thought of a monster.
I know you really don't like a stranger,
I don't like anyone. I hate monsters.
Damn, someone's a little speciesist. He works for an organization called Spookhouse, along with some other skilled monster slayers, each with their own surprisingly interesting backstories and personalities. A Dampier, which is half human, half vampire, was set to be one of the main characters. In development she was named Nekra, but that changed to Svetlana, probably to fit her Russian background, but she did end up being one of the main characters and one of the most notorious Spookhouse agents. If any of you are familiar with the game Blood Rain, Rain was actually supposed to be Svetlana, but I'll get into that more towards the end of the video. Elspeth Doc Holliday is another main one, and she's kind of like the weapons specialist, and she becomes the main protagonist of Blair Witch Volume 1, which is technically a pre-sequel to this thing. Again, I'll get to that near the end. And that's mainly all you need to know beforehand. There's a bunch of other Spookhouse agents, but I don't really want to spoil anything because I feel like you should go and discover them on your own. Stranger's never called anything outside of, Stranger throughout the entirety of the game, and it seems like nobody really knows his true name. However, in the credits for voice acting, Stranger is listed as Joshua Stranger. According to an interview, while this was never actually revealed in-game, Joshua really was his first name. In the interview, they were talking about Stranger making up the first name Joshua to satisfy the bureaucratic procedure required by Spookhouse, yet that it really was his first name. Future games would have elaborated on this more, but we'll never know, because none of you assholes ever bought or played this game. Shame on you all. Apparently, in 1923, Spookhouse accepted the enlistment of this mysterious man without any history or identity. He rose almost immediately through the ranks as one of the top Spookhouse agents, and while he's not superhuman, he's adequate beyond belief, and there's rumors and speculation that he was trained from a very young age to be the perfect monster murderer. So Stranger's got a pretty cool backstory, but they keep it mysterious enough without giving too much away to keep things a little interesting. Personally, I would have wished that we would have gotten more into Stranger's backstory in a sequel, and it seems like that probably would have happened because Joshua Stranger was supposed to be explained a little more, but I don't know, man. I just wish we got another game. Without giving too many spoilers, I love all of the main characters of this game. I think they're handled really well where it counts. However, Stranger is probably one of my favorite characters in gaming, even though this is really the only game we ever get to experience any of his adventures. He's one of the most stoic, badass cold killers out there, and they did such an awesome job with his character, especially thanks to the late Lynn Mathis, rest in peace, who brought so much life, or I guess stoic unlife, into this awesome character.
I need rum.
There's a saloon in the middle of town, but this really isn't the time.
Yes, it is.
I'm safe enough right here. That door's locked and no one's going to get in here.
But you're wounded.
I'll be fine.
You can't even cock that shotgun, much less aim it with only one arm.
I don't need help. You're the one who needs help.
What the hell? Crazy bitch.
Hey, Sonny, slow down. We can't keep up with you. Do you even care if we make it to the church alive?
Marginally.
His cold-bloodedness, absolute loathing nature towards monsters, and his irritable attitude towards everything and everyone around him all work better than you would expect. They could have easily made Stranger an eye roll of a character and just way too much of a try-hard edgelord. It definitely seems like that's exactly what he is on paper, but they really managed to make his dialogue and personality just serious and relatable, if that's even the right word. Relatable, I guess, enough to be a really likable character. I especially loved how he gives the Spookhouse passwords when he enters, and by the end of the game, though we don't get to experience it that much, he is so sick and fed up of doing the password thing.
The world is a dark place.
Who will protect the world from darkness?
We will.
This is ridiculous.
Everyone has to say the password, Stranger. Even you.
An intruder would be dead by now.
Rules, Stranger. You think I enjoy sitting in this little box all day?
Your enjoyment does not concern me.
The password, Stranger.
By this point, I could have killed you and flipped the switch to open the door myself.
You wouldn't do that. Would you?
The world is a dark place.
Who will protect the world from darkness?
We will, after we play our stupid games.
Have a nice day.
What's left of it.
And these moments are pretty small, but they add a lot to his character, and I just love it so much. Stranger for president replacing fucking Biden. One weird thing I did notice was that the game takes place during the Prohibition era, yet alcoholic beverages aren't taken with any precaution or anything. There's also some more advanced tech than what you'd expect for the time, like weapons having laser pointers and Stranger having these night vision goggles, obviously to help you out with aiming in the game. But I think they justified these being possible in the 30s because Spookhouse is supposed to get all these really cool, crazy, technologically advanced stuff, because they're funded by the government to slay monsters, so at least I think so. I don't think they ever said it in-game. So even though it's pretty weird to see stuff like night vision goggles and laser pointers in the 20s and 30s, it does kind of make sense in that perspective. It's not real, it's just a game, but it's a damn good one at that. Going back to the episode selection when you start a game, each of these 4 chapters have their own individual tales to tell, and they close at their end. There's no final boss of the game or some generic saving the world plot, and I can't stress enough how sick of those I am, and how refreshing something like this is. All of these episodes have their own specific All of these episodes have their own specific cases, and each of them are localized to where they take place. The reason for this was addressed in an interview before the game released. Monsters are everywhere, and there will never be any end of them. This organization takes things on a case-by-case basis, because that's all they could possibly do. And that's a very realistic explanation behind it. I mean, yeah, no, of course monsters aren't real. but if they were, they would always exist.
The Spookhouse will not wipe them out.
A group of 10 people isn't going to stop all of the evil in the world, and I love that. Each of the episodes also cater to a specific gameplay style. So episode 1 deals with a really good mix of combat, puzzles, and exploration, and it deals with the case of an artifact called the Yathfo Geostone, or as Svetlana calls it, the Yathki. It's located in a castle in Germany, and vampires and stuff. I'm trying to give basic descriptions because I don't want to spoil too much. Episode 2 has more of a focus on combat and exploration and less on puzzles, and it deals with the zombie infestation and Baron Samedi, and also a Lovecraftian Elderdom. Episode 3 deals with, as if the last one wasn't crazy enough, Al Capone resurrecting his dead mobsters to take over the town. Franken mobsters. Freaking amazing. I couldn't make up this stuff even if I tried. Although, this is where the gameplay does change and take a lot more of a focus on combat, and it has very little puzzle solving and less of a focus on exploration. And then lastly we got episode 4, and it deals with an ex-Spookhouse agent that hates monsters to the point that he built a mansion just to torture them in his spare time. It kind of mirrors Stranger's own hatred for them too, but I don't know if Stranger would even stoop to this incredibly cruel level. That's saying something. This ex-Spookhouse agent's backstory is explained in great detail when you go and you talk to the other Spookhouse agents about it. And honestly, I love this guy's tragic backstory. It does such a good job foreshadowing stuff and just... I don't really know how to explain it without spoiling things, but man, this episode's story and this character's backstory were so good to me that this could have been the premise of the entire game, and I would have loved it. But it's not. It's just one episode. And also from the gameplay standpoint, opposing the previous episode, this one has much less combat, but instead a much stronger focus on complex puzzle solving, and a lot of them are cheap with many instant death traps and some cheap solutions, like this turning one being able to completely softlock you in the game, which is no bueno, my friend. So when you do get to this puzzle specifically, before you do anything, make sure you make a hard save somewhere, like a specific file to save at, because you can quick save your progress, but then if you quick load, you messed up on the puzzle, you gotta start the whole episode all over again. Wonderful. Moving on to the graphics and visuals. God damn this game. This game's probably the best looking game to come out of the 90s, and it's a horror game nonetheless. This came out the same year as the original Silent Hill, but it still looks leaps and bounds ahead of it in terms of tech. Honestly, I do prefer that series, or at least the original 4 games when it comes to horror and horror experience in a game. But this one, despite being more focused on action than your typical survival horror fare, is still right up there with them. A lot of the monsters, more so earlier on, are typical stuff from your classic cliché horror movies like zombies, werewolves, vampires, etc, etc. But the ways some of the enemies appear before you are pretty clever and done well enough to make each of the encounters effective, unless this is like your 10th playthrough of the game. On top of that, there's tons of enemy varieties that I don't want to spoil, each of which have their own movements and abilities and weaknesses. My personal favorites, and one of the creepiest in the entire game, are the vampire brides, and they've reminded me a little bit of some of the enemies in Thief: The Dark Project. Probably because of the audio, I would guess. As soon as you start hearing weird, creepy, ghastly whispering in your ears, you're gonna know that they're nearby. The character models are also pretty detailed for the time. There's no mouth-moving animations, which makes them look a little weird and dated by today's standards, but the models still have a lot of touches and rather high polygon counts, so they look pretty good. Nocturne also pretty much, I think, pioneered cloth physics in games. Anything that people wear that's long and dragged around like a trench coat, a cape, or a regular coat, etc., all have their own specific polygons and have, like, some sort of weird ragdoll physics applied. They painstakingly got every single vertice to respond to the force being applied to it, whether it's the direction the character is running, some wind blowing, or something else. If you didn't limit the frame rate like I said earlier, then this looks really goofy and spazzes out. It clips all over the place and it's just bad, and it's not how it's supposed to look. At 60 frames, it looks tolerable, but again, you gotta play this at like 30 or 40 for the proper effect, or really on older hardware to see how cool this actually was. I think most people have played this game on their newer PC without even touching the frame rate, and then they assume that that's how it's always been, you know, super glitchy and stuff, but that was not the case. It looks so cool, especially for the time, and don't even get me started on this game's lighting. This game uses lighting as an art form. There are lots of older games that make actual proper use of lighting. Not to be like, oh look, shiny graphics, but games that used it to genuinely enhance their atmosphere and how the player is feeling. Even though these games are older, among the games I think have the best lighting would be games like Thief 1 and 2 and Deadly Shadows especially, Doom 3, all of the Silent Hills, and this. This game just does such an amazing job with its lighting system, and I think it's rather unheard of for cinematic angle-based games. Aside from maybe Silent Hill, but this game is damn close with the lighting and in some cases rivals it, despite being on much superior hardware, so I guess that's just a testament to how incredible Silent Hill was, but On top of that, the visuals never shied away from explicit adult content, which I guess by today's standards are rather common, but still, it was all handled in a very normal and mature way, as opposed to other games at the time that were edgy purely for the sake of just being edgy, appealing to teenagers, but managed to keep quiet when parents rioted. The developers had said since the beginning that this game was not meant for younger children in any shape, way, or form, and was intended from the moment it was conceived to be a fully adult-oriented game. And I got some respect for that, because it took balls to say that back then, especially at a time where games needed to appeal to a wider audience in order to sell. This game has a very elusive gore system that I wish more games had. It's a little standard for the time in the sense that this was the time when games started implementing locational based damage, and you shoot something, it dies, you shoot something past a certain amount of health, it jibs. But the blood is so freaking cool here, especially to other fans of horror. It splatters around and it drips and it sprays and it paints the walls and floors. It's just awesome. Just like the lighting, it's treated as an art form or something. I swear, I'm not as sadistic as I sound right now. But god damn, dude, look at some of this stuff. Not only is the gore awesome, but they put some cool little details throughout it, like how whenever you step on a pile of blood or a corpse, you can take steps that leave bloody footprints, and fade away as you take more steps, making it look like blood off your boots are being scraped on the floor, and on top of that, the corpses and all of the blood and gore never disappear. Unless you reload a game, of course, but still. This must have destroyed PCs back in the day. I mean, really, still, the only games I think of that ever managed to do that was Max Payne, which came out 2 years later, Fear, which also came out a few years later. No, Fear came out 5 years later. And the Build Engine games and the IdTech games, but those were all 2D sprite-based games. They weren't full 3D like these. So that's really impressive to me. I love it in this game, especially because of how insane the blood and gore is, but yeah, I mean, you can play this level for an hour, and you can still pinpoint all the areas exactly where you unleashed your pulp carnage on all the creatures. It's just awesome, and I wish games now allowed stuff like this. So Nocturne is a beautiful game for its time, and it still looks incredible. But what about the gameplay itself? Well, the core gameplay is the classic explore, shoot things, solve puzzles, and shoot and explore some more kind of stuff. This might be the only survival horror game out there that has mouse support, like old school cinematic camera angles with tank controls type of survival horror. But yeah, the controls with this game, using the mouse, are great, because it makes you so much more accurate and it feels so much smoother than tank controls. But I'm so used to tank controls that I usually end up playing this game with them. Do not think of yourself as a little bitch for playing with the mouse, because this game is still plenty tough, and I'll get to that too. But the controls are pretty solid considering it's using tank controls, and are usually pretty responsive and tight. And I love being able to aim up and down, because you feel so much more in control of your shots, as opposed to most other games at the time where you just had to turn. Which, to the game's defense, weren't really issues with the games themselves, but more because the controllers only had so many buttons. To make this even better, is that these crazy bastards made the controls as flexible as they could be for something in this genre, taking full advantage of a keyboard and mouse. You can even strafe in this game to avoid attacks. So if you really wanted to, you could set the controls to mimic an FPS game and play it that way. This to me is one of the multiple edges that this game has over every other survival horror game that I've played. Except for Silent Hill, because of course it's Silent Hill, and also another game called Eternal Darkness, which I do really want to cover on this channel at some point. And there is auto-aim, but let it be known that if you're gonna play this game, you pretty much need to play it with the auto-aim on, unless you're like a hardcore Nocturne fan that plays this game every single day or something. You already know every single pixel of the game in and out. It's gonna be way too difficult to properly play this game without it, especially if it's your first time, so don't say I didn't warn you. Going with this, it's kinda weird how his pistols have lasers, because this takes place in the 20s and 30s, but it could have been Spookhouse having access to greater tech for dealing with the supernatural. At least I think so. If not, then either way, despite it being kind of insane to put them in such a serious game like this, I think it was definitely a good call, because otherwise it would have been nearly impossible to tell where exactly you're aiming the guns from the angles in the game. So lasers plus auto-aim equals good in this game. On that note, the night vision goggles he's constantly wearing aren't just for show either. Doc Holliday gave these to Stranger, and according to the devs, they can be used to compensate for the issues where it's hard to see with the cinematic angles. When activated, you can go into this first-person mode, and even though it's pretty janky, it absolutely helps, and I'd be lying if I said it wasn't pretty badass. There's no actual textures in the game apparently, like they had just a flat plane and then they used visuals to kind of cover over it. Using these goggles kind of show that, but even then you wouldn't really have any way of telling without actually going through the game's files. The one area where the controls don't really do so hot is the platforming. I guess they took some inspiration from the original Alone in the Dark and thought, hey, the platforming in a game with specific camera angles and tank controls is a good idea. It's not. It's really... what the f***, guys? Any of you planning on playing this game for the first time, be absolutely prepared for these horrific platforming sections. They're easily the worst and most annoying parts of the game. You're gonna die over and over and over and over again from a jump that was too hard to predict because the camera angle made it look like you were jumping the right way. There's also a bunch of instant death traps, which I could also see being very frustrating, but those were fully intentional and the whole reason they let you save the game whenever you want. Because otherwise, you would not have a fun time with this game. Other than these, everything else with the game's difficulty I think is done fairly well, since most of the time you're going to feel like death is something you screwed yourself on. At least I did with all of my playthroughs, but I'm not going to speak for everyone else on that. Not really a part of the controls, but the game's use of detection triggers are also kind of off in some areas. Like the triggers for picking things up or using things are way too specific. Especially in the beginning when you're trying to pick up all these extra bullets. You're going to be spamming the use key right in front of what you're trying to use or pick up, and it just ends up not doing anything at all. Although, like I said earlier, this is more, I think, of an issue tied to the frame rate. Just something to take note of. I'll discuss combat later with the weapons and enemies and all of that, since it's the main #1 focus of the game, and is going to take a little while to discuss. So aside from the combat, you got your puzzles, your platforming, and your exploration. The game doesn't have too many puzzles throughout it. Like I said, episodes 1 and 2 balance it out pretty well, while episode 3 has very little of it, and episode 4 is pretty much fully consistent of them. These can range from things that are a little complicated to figure out, to ones that are easy to figure out but'll instantly kill you, so they're very mixed and all over the place. The exploration part is great, and you usually get a pretty good sense of feeling like you're exploring some weird place that you're not supposed to be at, thanks to the game's incredible use of dark atmosphere, though this can kind of be a chore when it comes to going through areas that require platforming. One of the things that kind of makes the platforming kind of weak in this game is the fall damage, because Stranger feels like a piece of paper when he falls down. Maybe not a piece of paper, but still, he falls down and feels like a weak piece of shit that can't take a jump. It's like a complete antithesis to his character. I guess that could have been what they're going for, because he's super powerful with guns, he's just weak when he lands and jumps and all that. I don't know, something nitpicky that I didn't like with the game. I can't be the only one that had problems with this, but I don't really see anyone talking about it either. You can actually completely die if you just fall down a couple of steps. So, feels like Stranger is a little bitch. A lot of the times, these platforming sections need to be jumped while avoiding other instant death traps, and those death traps aren't just with platforming, it just goes with the game's general exploration and the puzzles, and it's just... Point is, platforming kinda sucks in this game, and there's cheap instant death traps that go with it. Throughout the levels, you should make sure that you're always exploring, and always make sure to talk to people multiple times, because it could literally save your ass and turn the game from a survival horror to an action horror game. With enough exploration, you can find more ammo, items, and medkits and all kinds of stuff. Talking to people multiple times will give you various hints on enemies and even unlock little portions of the game you otherwise couldn't access. For example, on the first level, if you talk to this guy, he mentions silver bullets being the wolves' weaknesses in the next level. And if you talk to this guy, he says the same thing. But if you talk to him again, he mentions someone named Yuri. So when you go to the next level, you call for him and he lets you in, gives you a bunch of useful items, and you get to enjoy a nice little cutscene. Had you not talked to the guy in the previous level enough times to mention Yuri, this entire water wheel area is completely blocked off. Another example is the prologue of the first episode, where if you go out of your way to talk to Doc Holliday, she'll give you a weapon that f***ing melts vampire enemies. Both of these scenarios are really important and easily missable ones, just like the rest. So always keep your senses sharp, just in case there's people who seem like they can be talked to multiple times. Speaking of exploration, the camera angles are very well done in the game, but in the cinematic approach. When watching someone else play, they're done very well and perfectly capture not only what Stranger's doing, but what everything around him is too, giving the feeling that there's always something watching your every move. I don't know if I even explained this right, but basically, you're always probably going to feel unsafe and that there's things after you because of all the various efforts and cues in the game. It's great stuff, and I know horror games have been trying to do this kind of thing for a lot of other games, and that's the reason why. It's because you can get a better sense of the things around you, and it makes you feel more on guard and more uneased and stuff, and it's just a great decision for horror. I don't know why people stop doing it. I really don't. Although, that might be because going to my next point, this in turn makes some sections rather frustrating. A lot of enemies are off screen, so you need to shoot at the corners without being able to see what you're killing. There's going to be times when you're shooting enemies or you're trying to, but you're blocked because you can't see anything due to the angle of the camera, and then there's other times where it's really difficult to see any traps or where you need to go due to them being outside of the screen you can currently see. So due to the combination of the camera angles and the crappy instant death sections, it might seem like these parts could be a deal breaker, but that's not all the case, at least not in my opinion. I definitely found them to be annoying to deal with, especially my first time around, but not quite to the point of feeling frustrating or making me want to quit the game or any of that. Give or take maybe a moment or two in the first playthrough. I can definitely understand this being a hassle for a lot of people, but it shouldn't be to the extent of ruining the entire game. To those of you that quit the game from dying so much, I say, grow a pair of balls and come back to the game, or really any horror game in general. Because come on man, dying is like an essential experience for horror games. It's a way of life. You gotta embrace it. Otherwise, why even bother playing an action or horror game in the first place? You just don't. Moving on to the levels, I think the level design for most of the game is pretty well done. Overall, breaking positives and negatives with each episode. Episode 1 was awesome. Personally, I found the first level kinda meh, as I did with the second level in the forest. The third level onwards, the game gets awesome. By the time I got to that point in my first playthrough, I fell in love with this game, and it really just got better and better as it went on, at least to me. Episode 2's levels are also amazing, and it starts off really good and it ends even better. All of the levels in this episode were great, though I found the part where you need to put this crate somewhere to be kind of dumb and very poorly shown or hinted at to the player. Also, these stupid ass worm things are so freaking annoying. And also, of course, some really cheap death traps that are also pretty annoying. Episode 3 was designed really well for the most part and was probably my favorite, though it was a little bit confusing due to some of the angles in the town level, and the combat was especially cheap throughout this episode over any of the other 3. Actually no, episode 3 isn't my favorite, but I do really like the concept, so that's probably why I said that, but episode 4 would be my favorite. You go through the city and visit various places, but you get to a place that I never really ever see get explored much in FPS games or action games really at all. In the middle of the episode, you get to check out an old film theater, and it's easily one of my favorite levels ever in any game. It's just so freaking cool, mowing down hordes of Frankenstein Al Capone mobsters in the middle of a movie theater with a Tommy gun. There's a sentence I never thought would leave my mouth. And lastly, episode 4 was the slowest one by far, but in an atmospheric sense, I think it was the best and really showed how moody and incredible this game's atmosphere can really be. There isn't really much combat and the ammo is very limited, so you gotta be mindful of everything. One thing to take a serious note of if you do get to this episode and play the game, it is fully possible to soft lock yourself in the clockwork puzzle here. So make sure before you start doing anything with this puzzle that you save your game beforehand. Otherwise, you're gonna have to start the whole level or possibly even the whole episode all over again. This puzzle is easily the worst in the game, not only because of the soft lock, but also because I think it does just a really poor job of showing how the puzzle works. Though it is possible to figure it out on your own, so I don't know, but I'm not gonna spoil it. If you did want to know the solution yourself, I'll make a separate video, and honestly don't feel stupid or that you're cheating or anything if you do watch it, cause this puzzle's retarded. Oh shit. Voice change, cause I'm editing this after I recorded all the dialogue, and I'm a little sick right now, sorry. But I think out of all of the episodes, episode 4 would probably be my favorite. Episode 3 was really good, and I think conceptually it's probably my favorite, but in pretty much every other department, episode 4 is really just something else. I just think it does a really good job with the survival horror feeling of the game. All your weapons get taken away, so you can't really do much in the beginning. And while you can get 2 weapons in the beginning, they don't do a very good job making it clear how you do that. So the first time you play this, you're probably not going to have the weapons, and you'll probably play it more like an actual survival horror game, where you have to use traps and stuff to kill monsters. But if you do know what you're doing and you get those 2 weapons, you can go full on out and just kill everything you see pretty easily. And you can also figure out what you want to do and just play the episode as you want. I also think this episode has the best atmosphere. I mean, all of the angles and all of the art design and everything is just incredible in this episode. So yeah, definitely my favorite. Before going on your adventures, each episode except 2 starts you off at a briefing level at the Spookhouse HQ. I highly recommend, as I said, that you explore and interact with everyone. because you'll learn more about the characters and Spookhouse itself, as well as getting more weapons that you otherwise wouldn't have at all. For general stuff regarding the levels, I do have to say that it is very easy to miss what you're supposed to do, as there's very little hints and handholding at all. I totally get that this is part of the appeal of horror games, and it is for me myself, but I feel like puzzles in games should be things that are more lightly hinted at or given some pieces to put together of a puzzle, rather than outright needing a strategy guide to figure out. Like in Silent Hill or Hexen 2, despite the latter not being a horror game, and despite them both having very complicated puzzles in the games, they still give you the pieces that you need to put stuff together. They give you little subtle hints and clues, so it's not completely impossible. In Nocturne, it's also very easy to completely miss keys or areas that need them, which should also be something to take note of. Some areas look like they're completely blocked out but aren't and lead to essential areas, while others look like they lead to explorable areas but are completely blocked off with an invisible wall. Many other games are guilty of a crappy invisible wall, but it's especially weird in this game with some of the areas that they chose to lock off. In the third chapter specifically, there are some really shitty, cramped areas in the town. You lead someone around named Icepick, and you can actually also softlock yourself here by getting stuck if you walk into one of these areas while he's following you. This one is more of an issue with some of the design rather than the technical side, but some things need to be triggered to happen and progress you, which can also be a little annoying. Like in the forest level, episode 1 map 2, Svetlana won't cross this bridge and keeps telling you to find another way across. So you have to go to the edge of this area, and she says she can make a massive jump across the rock, but you can't, so you should probably take the bridge. And then you have to go, do exactly that, and cross the bridge she initially kept telling you not to cross, which makes the finding of that area you just found feel completely pointless. And the last, admittedly nitpicky complaint I have with the game, the most important one and the one that sadly can really take away from your experience, is that the camera angles don't serve the combat well in this game, just like I said earlier. Take something like Silent Hill or Eternal Darkness, and the camera angles are used to nearly perfected amounts. The developers fully understood the different angles to use in order to serve the purpose of the atmosphere, the story, and the player's feelings, while also taking into account the player might also have to get into some combat as well. In Nocturne, the camera angles are great from a cinematic perspective, but in regards to being a video game with more of a combat focus than its brethren, this does become an issue, because the enemies will very often be attacking the player from outside the screen where the player can't see, so essentially you'll have lots of moments where you get attacked off screen, and since there's no directional indicator, you're going to be looking around at which angle the attack came from, and then you'll be turning and looking again while taking damage because you weren't quick enough, and then still not knowing where that last one came from, and it's just a cycle that you'll have to absolutely get used to, and it might even take repeated playthroughs before you can get used to where the hell the attacks are coming from and truly get yourself properly adjusted to this. It's sad because, like I said earlier, this is easily the biggest issue the game has, and despite my minor nitpicks earlier, I feel like if this one issue was smoothened out and fixed up, this game would have done a lot better in the sales department. It's a big enough issue to make people just straight up not want to play the game. But I promise you, if you can get past that, this game is one hell of a ride and it's totally worth playing. To the point where I think you'll have regretted never playing this thing. Speaking of the combat, it's pretty simple, and as with the gore system, it's locational based, which is pretty cool. Shoot an enemy in the head and they have a higher chance of dying quicker. Shoot an enemy's limbs off and they'll react accordingly with the limb that was severed off. With this, also like I said earlier, the blood isn't like normal bloody effects in games. It spills and drips everywhere in the general vicinity of whatever you shoot. It splats on the walls like buckets of paint and drips on the floor. I think it'd be pretty funny if one of the monsters like tripped over one of the blood pools. This is easily one of the goriest video games of all time, and that's a massive win if you ask me. Not to mention the things I said earlier about stepping on corpses and making little bloody footprint trails, and the awesome little things that add up. This whole thing is just endlessly satisfying, as I've said multiple times throughout the video. You can even pick up enemy limbs and beat other enemies to death with it. It's metal AF. Metal AF. Any game that lets you decapitate enemies and use their limbs to beat everything up is an automatic, certified hood classic. Luckily, to go with all of this, you'll get a pretty decent arsenal to cause all this mayhem with. You've got, first and most importantly, Stranger's signature dual pistols with laser sights. These have ordinary bullets, silver bullets for werewolves and zombies, aqua bullets for vampires, and mercury bullets for sentinels, imps, and demons. If you spoke to Doc Holliday during the prologue in episode 1, you get the Son of God, or the Charged Radiance Emitter, which shoots out a beam of sunlight and can instantly melt any bat or vampire-based enemy with a shot. It recharges over time, and that does take a bit, but damn is it useful. It's a shame you only get to use it for the first episode of the game, but it's a really, really cool weapon. You can also use some melee weapons like an axe, a holy relic that pierces things and works especially well against vampires, a sword, a shovel, a wooden stake, a shotgun that works kind of like a pump but isn't exactly the same, and it has a laser sight too, which is kind of cool, a crossbow with normal bolts for vampire enemies and blessed bolts for ghouls, a Tommy gun, yeah, a freaking Tommy gun, bundles of dynamite, a flamethrower, and an elephant gun. There's lots of cool stuff here, and I love how different weapons all have different strengths and weaknesses to different enemies, just like FPS games of the time. One of my favorite examples of this is when you shoot giant bats and vampire brides in the chest. They fucking explode, and it's one of the most metal things I think I've ever seen in any game. It's so damn satisfying to pull all of this off properly. I don't think I'll ever get tired of doing this. Every weapon in this game feels incredibly punchy and satisfying, just as it all should. Though, another nitpick, the damage you take and deal does have a little bit of inconsistency sometimes, where one attack does a small bit of damage while you do the same attack at the same distance, and the enemy will like blow up or something. It's not to the point of making the game frustrating, and it is a little bit of a nitpick, but it is something that should be noted and taken into account before you play the game. Something cool I noted was that Stranger never shows any sign of pain whatsoever, even when he's literally being burned alive, and can even continue mowing down hordes of creatures until the flames consume him. I'm not sure if this was a technical limitation of the engine at the time, or if it was fully intentional, but either way, it makes him seem even more badass. For items, you can use Stranger's night vision goggles at any time, granted the battery isn't out. You can also pick up doctor bags throughout the game, and these are just fancy portable medkits. Luckily, they're automatically used whenever you're really low on health, so that you don't have to scramble through your inventory when you do need it at the last minute, but fall too high to the point where your limbs rip off, and not even a pile of medkits could save you. Aside from ammo, weapons, keys, and healing items and all the normal stuff that you get, you also get various other items throughout the game that are specific to solve certain puzzles. And regarding the enemies, the AI is a little bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes it's really good, and other times it's tolerable but laughable, like at times when your companions get stuck trying to follow you upstairs and instead run towards your direction into the level geometry. And there's some enemies that run around in circles, then there's other times where enemies will realize they're about to die and start running away, which is really cool. And of course, moving on to the audio, the voice acting is amazing, though it sounds a little bit compressed on modern systems for some reason. Stranger was voiced by the late Lynn Mathis, who sadly died in 2003 from heart failure. May he rest in peace. Nobody's ever going to be able to replicate Stranger's voice. Lynn Mathis also voiced Baron Samedi.
Ah, the legendary Stranger, the man of mystery. You know, your dark past is not so secret in my realm. I know all about you.
Fascinating. Just revive Scat and be on your way.
Easy, man. Don't forget who you're dealing with.
The Alpha Werewolf,
Less insult knowing that it was you who destroyed my tribe.
and Count Voiku in this game, which is really impressive considering all of these characters sound like completely different people. Honestly, if he didn't pass away, I feel like he would have been one of the more iconic and leading voice actors today. His voice is just awesome, and I really don't think anybody else could replicate his voice for Stranger. One of my favorite video game voice actors ever, the also late John Galt, voiced all of these characters, which is another incredibly impressive job considering these all sound like completely different people. If you don't know who John Galt is, he also passed away fairly recently, and he voiced one of my favorite video game protagonists, Lo Wang of Shadow Warrior. Not the reboot, but the original one. And his voice was incredible in that game too. Couldn't even tell that it was this guy doing it. And while I do love the 2013 reboot that kicked off, I think my biggest issue was that we didn't get John Galt again. He is also just an incredible voice actor, and another one that should have gotten more recognition but really didn't. Unless you're like me and grew up with PC games, you got this and Shadow Warrior. But going off topic, so yeah. There's also other notable voice actors that were chosen for this game, like Jeremy Schwartz, who voiced Icepick, Smiley, Yuri, and General Biggs. Again, all sounded like completely different people. Did an awesome job with this game. There's also Rick Spiegel, Julie Mayfield, and Paul Stevens. And the last one that was notable but I wasn't able to find very much information on, Candace Evans voiced Doc Holliday and Svetlana. And again, another example where it's two completely different characters, two completely different personalities, yet she hit the nail on the head and did an incredible job for both characters. Even all the side characters still sound really good, which is really rare for a game that's made in 1999. The game had over 1,100 lines of spoken dialogue, which for video games was just unheard of for that time. In one of the interviews, they said, "You've never heard voice acting this good in a game before." And while we obviously have now, at the time, I don't think there was anything quite like this, except for maybe Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, and Blood Omen, and those games were objectively better in the voice acting department, but this one was really close, if not on par with it. And then in 2000 we got Shiny's Sacrifice, which also had incredibly good voice acting for the time, and was in the same realm of that with these games. But yeah, my point is, in 99, people probably did hear voice acting not good in a game before, but it was literally just Legacy of Kain, Blood Omen, and Soul Reaver. The sound effects are all also great, and they do their job pretty well. This game made use of EAX, and though I couldn't get it working properly, I did see a video of it on here, and it sounds incredible for the time, despite the type of game it is. I'll play a little brief clip of it, so check it out. For the full proper effect, just make sure you're using headphones, because otherwise you're not going to hear it properly.
Meet my pal Tommy. He does all the talking. Hey, you mug. What's the rumpus? Take it on the heel and toe, Yeg. Omerta. The what for? Rub him out.
And then we have the soundtrack. Hooray. The soundtrack is probably my biggest complaint with the game, aside from the angles being a pain sometimes and the cheap death traps. What's there fits pretty well, but also what's there comprises of like literally 2 songs throughout the entire game. Both public domain stuff that you've probably heard before and weren't original stuff for this game. The first and most common one was this thing. It plays in the installer, in the game's intro and main menu, and it's sprinkled randomly when things happen throughout the game. You've heard it in South Park, you've heard it in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you've heard it in, like, anything ever made. It's not a bad song, but once you've heard it at least a couple of times, you're probably going to be aching to hear something else. The other track, which I do honestly really love, was a track called Jungle Fire, taken from an ambience library called Cuckoo Land Ambience. This song was later changed and pitched and used for Kelly Bailey's Half-Life 2 soundtrack, you know, in Red Letter Day. And in both games, to me, it represents the same thing. A chilling, even haunting piece that represents something horrible is about to happen. Kinda like the calm before the storm, if you will. And it's like that in both games. In Half-Life 2, it's with all the crazy shit that's about to happen, and in here, it's with all the monster cases breaking out all over the world. It's a great track, and I wish the rest of Nocturne was filled with similar tracks like this, instead of the other public domain song. Not songs, just song. Man, it pisses me off. But nothing's perfect, right? Throughout Nocturne, there are some pretty cool Easter eggs you can find. In Act 4, you can find this game's signature developer room Easter egg, which is pretty cool. At the start of the episode in the Spookhouse agency, after you talk to the secretary and get out of the lift, you can go right here and press the action key on this picture to reveal it. It's a pretty neat little picture that has all the developers looking like they're somewhere in the 20s, which is really cool and adds to the immersion. Another cool little thing is in the 3rd episode when you're in the theater level, you can shoot the display case at the snack stand and take the candy for yourself. Then you can use the candy at any time to heal yourself, which is also really cool. There's also plenty of cheats that you can activate using the console by pressing F10 and then putting in various codes, all of them without any spaces. Every time you do this, you're going to hear a zombie groan or whatever the hell this is, when you do it properly. Aside from the normal weapon and health kind of stuff, like I am a cheating bastard for invincibility, some of the more fun cheats to use would be stuff like Big Head for Big Head mode, Old Hat to give Stranger a darker hat, T2000 to make Stranger Terminator and literally metal as fuck, Really Cold to toggle enemy AI, Thunderstorm or Snowstorm to toggle respective weather effects outside, neither of which actually worked for me, Baron Saturday to summon Baron Samedi, and Ebola to kill your opponents. Outside of this game, Monolith's masterpiece Fear actually had some nods to Nocturne. Fear is a secret government organization that fights paranormal threats. Sound familiar? Don't think that's a coincidence. Then later on in the hospital, you can find a painting on a wall with a woman in white with an umbrella, the exact same that was used in the Nocturne semi-sequel Blair Witch Part 1 Rust and Par, inside Doc's motel room. It also might interest you to know that there were a few things that ended up getting cut from the game, though nothing major. Most of the game stayed true to what it was always meant to be, with the exception of a few things that ended up getting cut, but not very much as far as I know. Some of it was due to time and scope, while some of it was censorship for some reason, despite the final game being chock full of gore and some waist-down nudity. You can re-implement some of this cut or modified content by playing around with the Nocturne editor, which you can download from a link I'll provide, and I'll show you exactly what you need to do if you want to see all of these in action as long as you so please. Briefly, I'll show the full editing stuff in another video if people want me to. The most important one is that there is supposed to be another playable character that got scrapped. This character is still there buried deep in the game files, but not enough that was developed with her. So none of the levels are fully completable with it since she can't even open doors, climb ladders, or pick anything up. Even still, she would have been a pretty cool playable addition to the Spookhouse team. I would tell you how to do this one, but it's kind of pointless because it would just replace Stranger entirely, which would be frustrating to swap back and forth between, so I would just recommend watching the footage of her and calling it a night. Next thing, because I'm sure you're all dirty little perverts too, there was actually supposed to be a model of Doc Holliday in the game where she was semi-topless. She was wearing a coat that opened in the middle, but there was nothing underneath it. Again, not exactly sure why this was cut since there's already more explicit nudity in the game, but the devs probably felt that it detracted too much from her character and would have the players focus on her knockers instead of anything that she was actually saying, so I guess it makes sense. Pose be gone, Spookhouse over tatas, am I right?
Oh hey, num-nums. I can hear the bells. Can you? Be gone! Not! I need to concentrate on
The Spookhouse.
This could be done by downloading the Nocturne editor, unpacking a specific file, unpacking another one, replacing the in-game one with the one in the unpacked file, and then repacking it all and running the game. It's a bit complicated at first, but once you know exactly what you're doing, it's not too bad. It's definitely a lot of work for some tatas though. Something else that was found by another YouTuber, I have no idea how he found this out, but in the first episode in the castle level, there are a bunch of lesbian vampire brides doing some kinky shit in one of the bedrooms, and you can hear their moaning throughout the level, getting louder the closer and closer you are, and the more excited one of them gets. This was probably cut so that the ESRB didn't have to give this an AO rating, and also, again, they probably felt that this was too distracting from what the game was really about. All of the other nudity in this game does serve a purpose, so it does make sense to why these two things were scrapped. I couldn't believe someone figured out how to pull these from the game files though. And yeah, you do essentially the same thing if you wanted this in your game. So you, replace this and some other stuff. But now you'd have to edit this castle file and then replace this line with this. Speaking of nudity, you can see Svetlana's milkers if you get a glimpse of her up close. That one was probably intentional, but I don't know what serves the purpose of that to the gameplay, so I don't know. Not complaining though. Regarding mods and stuff that people have made online for Nocturne, despite a loyal, small cult fanbase, there weren't really many Nocturne things people made. The official fan site was Planet Nocturne, one of those cool GameSpy things, but the site has pretty long since been gone, and that had everything people had made up until that point. Luckily, I was also able to find a collection of probably the only remaining Nocturne files online back from January 2006. So I'll also link this in the description for any of you that would like to check it out. Enjoy! Couldn't have found it without this guy on GOG, so insane detective work, and big thanks for being the reason that these files can now get saved. So what ended up happening after Nocturne? Well, despite its poor sales, surprisingly, quite a bit actually. They planned to work on the series for a very long time, but sadly, a real sequel was never released, and I think I've made that pretty clear throughout this video. They were able to secure the rights to the Blair Witch license and were tasked with making a game in that universe. So in 2000, they ended up developing their next game as a hybrid between a Blair Witch game and Nocturne 2. Although this takes place in between episodes 3 and 4 of Nocturne, so we still didn't get a proper finish. It's still a great game though, one I'd totally recommend. There was a planned trio of games for the Blair Witch license on the Demon engine. The first one was by Terminal Reality, the second one was developed by Human Head, and the third part was developed by Ritual. I will go over these some other time as a full trilogy. I just don't have the time to go over all of these today, because look how long this Nocturne video ended up being. Good lord. Just like Nocturne, they're painfully underrated games, although I'm assuming they did get more exposure than Nocturne because of their Blair Witch license tie-in. There was also a Nocturne movie that was planned, supposedly with a PG-13 rating, which would have been absolutely retarded. For a game so heavily marketed and intended for a specific mature audience with a taste for gore-filled horror, a PG-13 rating for this would have made the movie way too toned down to be appealing to anybody that was a fan of the game. but it still would have been cool to have gotten something as opposed to nothing like we have now, because it definitely would have brought Nocturne some well-deserved attention. After the work on the Blair Witch trilogy, the following year in 2002, they released a piece of concept art on what looked like Svetlana being attacked by various creatures and calling out for Stranger. Then they dropped a trailer for a brand new engine with new effects and new lighting engine stuff. It looked really cool, and this was just referred to as the new Nocturne engine, if I recall. Throughout the trailer, it showed a more aggressive Svetlana with blades attached to her arms, kinda like a Nocturne but much more defined and OP looking, and she's running around and slaughtering these giant vampire bats from Nocturne and some Nazis. This trailer was absolutely incredible. It's dark, it's violent, it's beautiful, and it teases just enough to make you really interested. Thankfully, we did end up getting this game eventually the next year, but with this Svetlana stuff dropped, and it became its own thing. Any guesses to what this was? If you guessed Svetlana the Vampire Slayer, you'd be wrong. But if you guessed Blood Rain, you'd be right. And you'll also get a cookie in the mail sometime. No promises. Blood Rain was also such a great game that I also have a big heart for, and the one that I actually grew up with way before I even knew about Nocturne or had any idea that the games were connected. But of course, this is again one I'll have to review some other time. A lot of people that were fans of Nocturne seemingly assumed that Svetlana's character was completely transformed into Rain, which I don't think is exactly true. Svetlana was the core inspiration for Rain's character, but apparently Rain is actually Svetlana's half-sister, sharing the same vampire father. This was hinted at in Blood Rain, at the beginning of the Louisiana mission. Mintz, which was another character in Blood Rain, mentioned to Rain that she has a half-sister, but it wasn't fully confirmed in the game, it was just loosely referenced and implied. It's a damn shame that we never got a proper end to the Nocturne legacy, but I am thankful that we got Blood Rain and, of course, the game itself. So is Nocturne worth playing, and does it still hold up today? Well, it is an action horror game, and depending on your point of view on the genre, it's either a timeless classic or an old worn-out coupe. If you ask me, I actually think this game has aged better than most others of its kind, mainly for how well everything is done. At least aside from the annoying platforming sections and some issues I had with the camera angles. So whether it has aged well or not, I think this is a game everyone watching this should absolutely go out of their way to check out. Once you get used to the controls and how the designs and puzzles are, it's a pretty fun ride. And I've gotten people who don't really care for the normally clunky and confusing gameplay of survival horrors to try this game out pretty recently and get surprised by how good it was. This is a game you can really tell the developers had a lot of love and fun putting together, and that, as well as the fact that this thing is still so goddamn fun to play over 20 years later, really shows the hallmark of a great game in my opinion. If you're spending the time and going out of your way to make something you seriously love and are proud of, then you're doing something right? Artwork, sound design, story, art design, gameplay, and even voice acting were all done superbly well. Even the scares, I mean, this is more of an action-focused game, but it still manages to keep you surprisingly invested and at the edge of your seat. At least it did for me. It's a good time, and there's very little to complain about, even though it seemed like I was bitching for half of the video, but no, I was just nitpicking and finding things to complain about. But Nocturne is a great game, and its atmosphere is almost unmatchable even compared to most other horror games. If game length is important to you, Nocturne is actually on the lengthier side for a horror game. It took me between 3 to 5 hours to get through each chapter my very first time, including my deaths and pausing and figuring out what to do, so if you haven't played the game before, then there's a pretty good chance it'll take you a whooping 12 to 15 hours, which isn't that long, but it's quite a bit for a horror game. Regardless, do yourself a favor, Chief, and give this severely underappreciated gem a spin. It's pretty doubtful you're gonna regret it.
Who will protect the world from darkness?
We will.
Or if you're a fellow goth gamer, we'll protect the darkness from the world.
After we play our stupid games.
Thank you so much for watching this RetroDeath review. If you enjoyed the video, it would mean a shit ton to me if you gave me a sub. It lets me know that you want more content, and lets you know when I make more. This video was a huge labor of love, and it's one of my favorite games of all time. So despite the countless hours it took, I'd say I had fun making it. And if it convinced you to play it, then it means I've done my job here. So again, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you soon in the next one. Stay retro and stay macabre.